the commercial sector, we have product market fit for startups. You want to find this generative engine where customers demand your product so much you can't keep up with the pace of growth, and that ultimately is driving revenue. I think there's something equivalent in the defense space that I've termed weapon warfare fit. And right now, as the U.S. develops weapons, they have strong hypotheses as to what we'll need, say, in the Pacific or on the battlefields of Europe. But without having that true crucible of combat, again, referencing the previous conversation about where innovation comes from, you really can't test it in the quote unquote marketplace of combat. And without that thinking enemy who's rubbing up against you to evolve that, all you have are hypotheses. And so they're good hypotheses, they're not necessarily wrong. But if and when we go to war with a near peer adversary, I would estimate that 40 to 60% of the weapon systems we have are going to be irrelevant. Now, I don't know which 40 or 60% those are right now, but we're going to discover things, quote unquote, through the marketplace of combat that'll then drive us to make changes and innovations.
Hey everyone, this is Prashant and I'll be your host for the VC10X podcast, and today we have Ben Kohlmann with us. Ben is a partner at Cubit Capital where he looks into frontier tech investments. Ben is a former F18 pilot in the US Navy. Ben led the Chief of Naval Operations Rapid Innovation Cell and is also the co-founder of the Defense Entrepreneurs Forum. In this episode, we talk about how's the experience of flying an F-18 fighter jet, how Ben built a culture of non-conformity within the US Navy, how is the speed of innovation in defense forces, what's the product market fit equivalent for defense tech startups, product validation in the battlefield, what insights do defense tech startups gather from the ongoing wars, how are defense tech startups different from software startups in terms of revenue and sales cycles, and so much more. So without wasting any time, let's dive straight in. This episode is sponsored by my own podcasting agency called Podcast 10X, where I help VCs start and run their own podcast. While I was running VC 10X, this podcast that you're listening to right now, I asked my VC guests, why don't you start your own podcast? I mean, it's the best form of marketing for VCs. As they say, VC is a people play more than even a capital play. A podcast enables you to put your people at the front, your portfolio founders, your partners, and co-investors. It's a great way to build a brand and win competitive deals. It activates all your marketing channels in a single shot, be it YouTube or blog post or newsletter or social media. Everything gets activated in a single shot. And I get the same response from all the VCs that it's a lot of work and we don't have the time for it. I said, all right, let me handle the work for you, from pre-recording, editing, publishing to making social media clips. All you have to do is show up on a call, hit record, do the recording using the well-researched outline we provide you with, and you're done. We handle everything else. You know what they said? All right, let's give it a shot. So if you are a VC and want to up your marketing and branding game, I'd love to work with you. And if you're thinking there are too many VC podcasts already, remember, there are way more VC firms out there. And if you're not standing out, you're losing out. So if you want to work with me on starting your podcast, go to podcast10x.com and book a call today. I'll add the link in the description and show notes below. Look forward to working with you. Hey Ben, so good to have you on the VC10X podcast. How are you doing?
Hey, Prashant, thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure having you on. To start things off, can we first have your story and then we can move into investing?
Yeah, for sure. So I started as a Navy pilot. I was always intrigued by naval aviation. My grandfather was a World War II aviator off the USS Wasp and USS Hornet, flew the Corsair, which is a pretty awesome airplane. And then when I was going through high school and middle school, really had a desire to join the Navy. So flew F-18s for about 8 years in the service. And while in the service, deployed to Afghanistan and the South China Sea to do some activities over there, and became pretty disillusioned with the way that the U.S. military was approaching innovation. And being a very, young individual, junior officer, there weren't a lot of avenues officially to push change. So I did what I do best, and that's start organizations that I wish I could be a part of. So in my living room in San Diego, started a book club. We called it Disruptive Thinkers. It was 5 of us. It was a couple entrepreneurs from the area and a couple military officers, and it took off like wildfire. There was a deep hunger in the 2012 timeframe amongst my generation specifically to think about new ways of fighting wars, to think about new acquisition pathways, and to think about how to integrate all the great technology coming out of Silicon Valley into our military. And from there, a lot of innovation organizations bloomed. Built a group called the Defense Entrepreneurs Forum, was asked by the Chief Naval Operations of the Navy to build a group called the Chief Naval Operations Rapid Innovation Cell, giving junior officers some money to experiment with technology aboard the fleet ships. Helped stand up DIU in 2015, Defense Innovation Unit, which was the first outpost for the DoD in Silicon Valley. Helped build hacking for defense at Stanford, and now I'm here. I'm at today.
That's a super incredible story for a VC, right? Talking about flying F-18s, they seem super cool from the outside, but I've never gotten a chance to talk to a fighter pilot and ask them this question: that how does it feel when you're on the inside of the plane and the plane is all upside down and going at crazy speed? How does that feel?
It is a surreal experience, and one that certainly takes a bit of time to get used to. But once you do, and you've started to crack the code on flying, it literally feels like an extension of your body, which is a pretty remarkable experience. And the way they've designed the cockpit, it's very tight, but it's not uncomfortably tight. And everything is designed ergonomically for your hands to rest on the throttle and the stick. And they have different designs now in new airplanes. But once you've got the muscle memory down, it's amazing what you can do with the aircraft. And I think pulling G's is the thing that people think about a lot when they think about being a fighter pilot. What's interesting about that is getting your body is not acclimated to multi-G maneuvers. But once you do get acclimated, it's like working out, where your body starts to crave those endorphins. And I remember kind of later in my flying career, when I was an instructor pilot, would come back from flights just like hyped up on endorphins. But the thing is, it quickly goes away. A couple of years later, I was at a short tour, not flying, and was asked or invited to fly with a buddy of mine who was a Blue Angel, and so I went in his back seat, and I got to go through a show with him. And because I hadn't pulled G's in a long time, it was really rough on the body. I passed out twice, and I came and I was like dragging off the tarmac. So it's a learned skill, but one that is pretty remarkable.
Totally. And is it really hot on the inside, or is it like high pressure? How's it? How does it feel there?
In terms of temperature, or
Yeah, in terms of temperature, one, and in terms of the pressure you feel, right?
oh yeah.
Right.
So I mean, there's air conditioning, and you can adjust the
Okay.
internal chamber and stuff like that.
Right.
Um, it just depends on the scenario that you're in. Combat is certainly high intensity.
Right.
I was a carrier pilot, and so landing behind the boat is very high intensity. I think there was a study done that the cortisol levels of pilots landing on carriers at night, and cortisol's um, the bodily fluid or chemical that goes through you when you're in high stress situations. The cortisol levels of carrier pilots at night was higher than Navy SEALs doing missions. So it can kind of give you a sense of it's a brief moment, the last 15 seconds of flight. It's pretty intense. But yeah, it can be pressure filled. And in combat, a lot of dynamic things are happening. It's hours of sheer boredom followed by moments of sheer terror, and so you got to be prepared for those moments. But you kind of find out what you're made of in those moments.
Yeah, totally. And I read a story in Harvard Business Review, which was about you fostering a culture of non-conformity within the Navy, right? So tell us more about that.
Yeah, so that was really a deep dive into the Chief of Naval Operations Rapid Innovation Cell, a Wharton psychologist named Adam Grant, who's done a lot on high performance teams and how to drive culture, was interested to see what we had built, because it was very unusual for senior leaders in the military to hand over innovation authority to junior officers. The military is a very hierarchical organization, and there's very good reason for that. But in this experiment, we had a lot of big ideas, and they said, okay, put your money where your mouth is at. And traditionally, people in the military are given important and influential jobs based on past performance, which makes sense. You want the best performers to be in command roles, et cetera. But in the innovation space, you really want thinkers who are off the beaten path, who have a different view of the world, who are willing to challenge orthodoxy. And sometimes those can be hard to find in the military because the individuals who stick their head above the ground and wave the flag about something are often very quickly squashed. Again, let me just be very clear. Many military contexts require conformity, require a hierarchical system where the commander is directive for people and where they go. But that can also stifle creativity. And if you're in a moment in the history of an organization where you need an infusion of new ideas, you really have to look for a different type of personality. I mean, this is why Silicon Valley is so compelling for a lot of people, because it drives our society forward. But we were recruiting individuals who had black marks on their record, those who had gotten in trouble for writing articles or speaking up, or even had failed engineering exams. And again, we weren't operating a nuclear powered submarine where you'd need to have that knowledge or the directiveness. What we were doing is say, how can we push the envelope? And those are the type of folks that I was drawn to and recruited. And what was interesting about that is many of the individuals who had gotten in trouble previously did so because they were deeply frustrated and they didn't have an outlet for it. As soon as we gave them an outlet for their creativity, they flourished and they were able to build relationships with very senior people, and they won the trust of those senior people, so much so that when they went back to traditional Navy career paths, those individuals kind of came in to protect them because they realized in the right context, this individual, this creativity, these ideas could be channeled for productive ends. And we were able to do that well in the CRIC. And I think that's what Adam was so interested in the article, is how did we build that community? How did we build that culture in this organization that is typically known for conformity?
Yeah, totally. That's a super interesting story on how you went about doing that, and recruiting people who had black spots on their careers and doing things that are not usual, right? Uh, and then, like after this happened, and then how's the general speed of innovation within defense forces? How do you see that?
I think there's two categories to consider. One is peacetime innovation, and one is wartime innovation.
Right.
And those are very important distinctions. So peacetime innovation, and I think this goes for organizations across the gamut. Even large Fortune 500 companies,
Yeah.
large institutions. If there's no outside pressure, there's no existential requirement to innovate. And so if you take that to the
Very true.
military context, you know, outside of Iraq and Afghanistan, which, let's be clear, were very important wars, the U.S. military hadn't faced what we call a near-peer adversary, someone like World War II or World War I who could match us force for force. And as a result, we didn't really have that internal motivation to create the next generation of technology that would clearly win on the battlefield. But where we did see very rapid innovation was at the edges, on the front lines. One example is the MRAP, mine resistant. I'm going to get the acronym wrong. But anyway, it was a vehicle that evolved from a need on the battlefield that infantrymen were facing as they were driving through the roads of Afghanistan and Iraq. There were small homemade bombs that they would run over. It would blow up their Humvees, and their peers would die. And so there was no ready-made solution that the acquisition process had hypothesized beforehand. So the soldiers took it in their own hands and, you know what, we're going to protect ourselves. We're going to take these raw sheets of metal and bolt them to the sides and to the bottom of our cars or our trucks, and then use those to drive. And so that was the kernel of innovation. I think you're also seeing that in Ukraine, especially, where when the Russians invaded a couple of years ago, the weapons that the Ukrainians had were designed for a different type of warfare. They realized quickly that they were not going to be able to take on the Russians head to head. So they had to come up with options that kind of enveloped the enemy. And this is where the drones evolved. And what's interesting is, a lot of the drones the US had built were high end, they were expensive, they were hard to produce. They weren't purpose built for the battlefield in Ukraine. And so what did the Ukrainian soldiers do? Well, they started to piece together parts from off the shelf equipment. They put on cameras. They recruited and trained drone racing pilots to evolve the tactics and techniques. And it was this crucible of combat that forced innovation to occur. One other thing I'll say on the innovation front is you look at something like battlefield medicine. Iraq and Afghanistan, the silver lining there was battlefield medicine got immensely better. They discovered this thing called the golden hour, where if you could get to someone within 1 hour of them being shot, their probability of survival went up exponentially. So that created an operations system where you had helicopters on demand. They could grab these folks, bring them back to the doctors. The doctors knew how to operate, and many individuals lost limbs, but they kept their lives. And so again, it was that being on the edge, the crucible of battle, that allowed that innovation to flourish. But the further you get back from the front lines, the broader your time frames with a real adversary, that's where innovation grinds to a halt.
Totally. That's such amazing insight there. And is there any mechanism on how these stories, on how these instances are when they're taking place in the battlefield, how these stories are being maybe transported to people like you, or maybe people in the authority, for so that they can do something with this information and maybe develop some solutions based on that information, right?
Operationally, the military has after action reporting. So, they'll look at past lessons learned from battles or what lessons were learned. And a lot of the tactics and strategy classrooms are filled with, let's just call them case studies from past battles, and they'll have maps and like this situation, this is how this leader thought about it. And on the technology front, there's certainly some feedback loop back to the R&D shops, to the acquisition officials who need to buy certain things. But what's interesting is a lot of those things are even backward looking. And I think this is where an equivalent to the commercial market is relevant, is the technology that is being sold today is relevant for customers right now, and they're clearly paying money to get access to it. But in 5 years' time, it will likely be obsolete. And so the technology that's evolved in the battlefield has a very, very narrow shelf life in a true combat situation. Even look at like the evolution of World War II or Vietnam weapons. Those evolved to meet battlefield needs. And this is where this concept I've been thinking deeply of is, in the commercial sector, we have product market fit for startups. You want to find this generative engine where customers demand your product so much you can't keep up with the pace of growth, and that ultimately is driving revenue. I think there's something equivalent in the defense space that I've termed weapon warfare fit. And right now, as the U.S. develops weapons, they have strong hypotheses as to what we'll need, say in the Pacific or on the battlefields of Europe. But without having that true crucible of combat, again referencing the previous conversation about where innovation comes from, you really can't test it in the quote unquote marketplace of combat. And without that thinking enemy who's rubbing up against you to evolve that, all you have are hypotheses. And so they're good hypotheses, they're not necessarily wrong. But if and when we go to war with a near peer adversary, I would estimate that 40 to 60% of the weapon systems we have are going to be irrelevant. Now, I don't know which 40 or 60% those are right now, but we're going to discover things, quote unquote, through the marketplace of combat that'll then drive us to make changes and innovations. Let's look at World War II. So, the U.S. started out with the Wildcat, which was a single-engine fighter off carriers. It was underpowered. It was very heavy. It was designed in a peacetime environment. It was good enough for that solution. Well, when the Japanese attacked, they had the Zero. And the Zero was purpose-built to be a fast, agile fighter. They also had pilots who had been trained in a couple of years of warfare in China. So when the U.S. and the Japanese first fought each other, the Zero far outperformed the Wildcat. So what did the U.S. do? They learned from that, and the first was a tactical innovation. Using the tool they had, the Wildcat, a gentleman named John Thatch, who was a junior officer, came up with what was called the Thatch Weave. And this was really incumbent on two Wildcats flying together. And if they were attacked by a Zero, they could use the two in tandem to fly a certain formation and a certain level of things that would basically put the Zero in a position to be shot down. And that was great. It worked. What they realized is they needed a purpose-built aircraft to defeat the Zero. And so they transmitted this information back to the U.S., to the airplane designers, and they came up with the Hellcat and then the Corsair. And those were purpose-built to be high power, have the right type of weapon systems, have the right type of cockpit ergonomics, the bubble canopies so you could see behind you instead of being blocked by a big thing, because a lot of times you're in combat and someone's behind you. Like those things were ergonomic and battlefield requirements that were built into the systems. And so that is where the true battlefield innovation will come into play. and where at that point weapon warfare fit has been found. And like I think a great example of that is in Ukraine. Again, they've built these drones that have evolved over 2 years of war with slight modifications that there is insatiable demand for right now, whether it's on the ground or from U.S. producers or European producers. The customer, i.e. the frontline warfighter, can't get enough of these. Like, you've found something interesting there.
Yes, totally. And it's very interesting to learn all these stories that you're sharing here, right? And we have multiple ongoing wars even right now as we speak, right? Do these events become critical market study events for defense tech startups?
You see a number of defense tech startups looking to the lessons learned of these environments to either project what the future warfare, what would future warfare look like, or what current warfare is going towards. Before getting to that, I want to be very clear. Like, the lessons learned here come at an immense human cost, and I would far prefer us to be in a world where we have very slow innovation on the military front, but don't have wars. Like, if we are learning on the battlefield what's next, this is catastrophic for society. And so while we're talking about kind of the crucible of combat and the lessons learned here, I don't want to forget that the human cost and the hundreds of thousands, potentially millions of lives lost in Ukraine right now. And once the Rubicon's been crossed and war goes on, it's incumbent for those who are charged with defending our country to take a very hard look at reality and figure out what has to be done. So, getting back to your question about what are defense tech startups learning, I think they're looking to Ukraine, looking to what's happening in Gaza, looking to what's happening elsewhere, and seeing what evolutions are happening on the battlefield and adjusting to that. You know, you hear this term, low cost, autonomous, expendable systems. This is potentially the future of warfare. So what does that mean in all domains, everywhere from space to air to the surface, both on water and on land and undersea? And you're seeing a lot of startups attempting to address this. I think the challenge is, and this gets back to the earlier point, without the existential crisis, and I'll just use the U.S. military as an example because I know that best, without an existential crisis to fight against, there's not the impetus within the bureaucracy to push these things through quickly. I'll give you one example on the counter, though, is, you look at the Red Sea, where the U.S. has a task force, a carrier strike group, that's there to protect international shipping, because the Houthis in that region have started to use low-cost drones to at least create enough havoc where commercial shipping is being shut down. Well, for the longest time, F-18s could only carry AIM-9Xs, which is an air-to-air missile that's in short range on the wingtip stations. You can only carry 2 of them. Well, the Houthi drones are very small and they're cheap. Do you want to expend a $2 or $3 million long-range AMRAAM, or would you rather expend a $500,000 short-range AIM-9X? Well, you prefer the latter because it's cheaper, it's more replicable. So the Navy went through a crash program in the last month to do a testing to authorize the launch of AIM-9X missiles from the the outboard pylons on the wings, which means now they can carry 4 of these things. So that's a small example of battlefield innovation that's driven by actual real-world activities. So there was just a picture yesterday that came out of an F-18 launching off the carrier deck, and it had 4 AIM-9Xs on it because of this crash program to evolve and meet a very real threat that they had to counter that was different than what they had seen before. So I think the best defense startups are able to do that. The challenge, though, and this is actually where the Defense Innovation Unit has gone, is, we've realized that R&D is important, but at the end of the day, you need scale and mass. I think that the government would rather have an 80% solution that solves most of their problems, but have it ready now and produce 5, 10, 15,000 of them in the next year or two, as opposed to really exquisite whiz-bang things that can do all this stuff and solve all these edge cases. Because 1, that takes forever to build, but 2, ramping up their production lines are very difficult and costly. And one of the bigger challenges we have in the U.S. is the industrial base limitations. And that's driven for a variety of reasons, but the reality is we've outsourced a lot to other countries, and that prevents us from having control over what we produce and when. And so these low-cost attritable systems aligned with warfare needs, if they can be built domestically in a quick scale, will solve things better. And this is where Replicator, that program many of you have probably heard about, the U.S. is funding, is trying to play is, we don't necessarily want the best technology. We want good enough technology that within a year or two, we can produce a large scale of, because we know future warfields will require that.
Yes, totally. And you mentioned how what is PMF for defense tech startups, right? And let's also talk about some other fronts of other typical startups, right? Which is, one is product validation, and the other is what can be the potential scale of product, like what is the potential demand of this product, right? So
Yeah.
how do defense tech startups do these two things? One is product validation, and the other is what's the potential scale of this product?
So product validation has to be done in the field. Again, I think the ultimate product validation is in warfare. Again, we never want to get to warfare. I hope it never happens. If we cross that Rubicon, your product will be best validated in combat. Is it valuable? Are users demanding it? And as such, is it flowing back to the acquisition and the funding lines in DoD? But before that, the US military especially has a lot of exercises where they invite startups to experiment and show off their goods and see how it integrates into systems. One of the challenges there is the incentives between venture-backed startups, venture capital firms, and the government are very different. And it's not bad that they're different. They have different things they're solving for. The government is solving for fighting and winning wars, and that has nothing to do with the profit motive. They want a large experimental moat or experimental lake that they can play in and see things, and then pick and choose the one or two of the thousands they see that will be directly relevant. On the other hand, private capital startups and investors, they need financial capital, which means that they need to expend dollars to then win dollars down the line. What the government is doing right now, again, is very aligned with what they have to solve for, but it creates a deep problem for the startups in the defense ecosystem, because the government is basically saying we want the private sector to bear a lot of the R&D development risk, and if you do well, we'll maybe give you a contract or not. That's hard to raise capital on. And so there's programs in place right now trying to bridge that gap. You have the SBIR program where the government will give grants for R&D. You have things like the Office of Strategic Capital, which is trying to match dollars from the private sector to solve really hard problems in the government. But even then, R&D dollars or these grant dollars are not the same as production contracts. So getting to scale is a real challenge. But at the end of the day, it comes to getting in front of users and working with the users hand in hand to understand what the true problem to be solved is. But the second challenge is product validation is not enough in the government. And it's never enough in the commercial sector either, though it's a little bit easier. But then you have to win over the acquisition officials, who oftentimes are deeply removed from the end user, just based on how the structure of the government funding goes. And so even if you have product validation, that does not necessarily mean you'll get funding for it, even if it's meeting a deep demand. Because the acquisition official has to either cannibalize existing budgets or somehow advocate for net new budgets to come on. And a lot of these budgets are set in stone, 2, 3, 4 years beforehand based on production needs. There's not much slosh in the system to allow for bolt-on new technologies in a rapid way. And again, that is incentivized over decades of evolution in our system. There's pros and cons to that. One of the cons happens to be the inability to move quickly. So that's where that challenge comes in there. And the second question, sorry, you'll have to remind me what that second question was.
Yeah, so the first one was about validation, and the other one was about how do they determine the scale that the product can achieve.
Yeah. This one is trickier. The military can intimate what they think the scale will be. Oh yeah, in 2035, if we're at war, we will need X hundred, X thousand of these systems. The trick is that's kind of an insurance policy where, again, you hope you never go to war. Part of the strategy right now is how can we create a deterrent effect, the prickly porcupine approach, where we have so many front-end weapon systems that any adversary who would want to do something would be dissuaded from doing it. Now, you need fewer in a deterrent scenario, although you need enough to prevent the enemy from doing that. And then you need to pull this, flip this switch where, okay, say the flag goes up. Do we have the production capacity to do this? So I think defense tech startups have to look at kind of two tranches of scale. One is, what is the deterrent tranche? And for society, what does it take to prevent that war from happening? And then what is the production tranche that if things go south, we can produce? This is hard math to do, because as you're telling investors, as you're talking about potential revenue things, from a business perspective, you want as many units as possible. But I think you have to be realistic about what the near-term need will be, and also not just the near-term need, but what's the likelihood of adoption. And one of the challenges that I'm seeing right now with a lot of defense tech startups is they have really great standalone products. The second level question that has to be answered is how does it integrate into the existing ecosystem of legacy platforms, of legacy software systems? You can't just bolt this on net new by itself. It has to somehow get into the workflow of the battlefield commanders, of the users on the front line, of the intelligence analysts, such that it's accretive and not just one more burdensome thing they have to deal with. That is really hard to do with defense tech startups.
Totally. And let's also talk about the sales cycles for defense tech products. How long and hard are these sales cycles?
They're definitely challenging. They definitely, I don't know if, net, if they're longer than like large organization B2B sales cycles, because, these big, like, the Ciscos of the world and others, they can be very, they have their own process in place. It is more nuanced and challenging because you really have three, sometimes even four stakeholders you're trying to win over. One is the frontline uniformed individuals who, again, are kind of the market testers. They don't necessarily have decision-making authority, but they'll validate your thing. Then you have the acquisition officials who are going to either accept it or not into a program of record, and it has to be within the broader framework. There has to be budget aligned with that. Then there's the congressional allocators who, at the end of the day, kind of set the budget for Congress and can do special carve-outs, for a year to 5 years down the line. So the trick is like, how do you blend those three together to create a flywheel that gets you revenue to allow your company to survive? But they're all solving different parts of the ecosystem. You have to have an understanding, that Washington doesn't necessarily run on the currency of money. Money is important, but it's not the most important. It's power and relationships. And that's a very different muscle than the commercial world, where relationships matter. At the end of the day, like, it's about profit. It's about dollars. You can actually see where the incentives are. The Washington currency network is a lot fuzzier. You look at what Anduril did, and honestly what the primes have been doing for the primes being Boeing, Lockheed, Raytheon, all those folks for the past 20 or 30 years. They go to Washington and they spend a ton of time and dollars on building relationships. Palmer Luckey and Trey Stevens at Anduril talk about this publicly, but they spent more money on lawyers and lobbyists the first couple of years of Anduril than engineers, because they realized it wasn't necessarily about the best tech. Well, that was kind of a necessary but insufficient step. It was actually who's going to buy this when, and can we win their trust such that when the contracts come out, or we can help write the contracts, that they will be able to win those to solve the needs. So it's just a very different market muscle for those startup entrepreneurs.
Right, totally. And talking about the entire defense tech landscape, you must have some subcategories within defense tech, or how you look at different kinds of solutions that are there, right? So at Cubit Capital, what are those subcategories that you have identified where you'll be investing your dollars?
A lot of our focus in the past year has been on the traditional research and development and then eventual production contracts. And this kind of comports with the way that the U.S. splits out their defense budget. We have an R&D budget, which is somewhere, I'm going to get the numbers wrong, but order of magnitude, about 10 or 15%. You have the procurement budget, which is another, 15-ish%. Then you also have this operation and maintenance budget, which is actually the new president's budget is up to 40%. But this is like, hey, how do you take this sexy new hypersonic airplane and keep it alive for 30 years? It's not just about buying it and using it for 1 year, but like this long tail of sustainment. F18s have been in the fleet for 20 years, sometimes 30 and 40. Like you need to keep those things running. We focus primarily on let's fund things that are net new R&D, fancy new weapon systems, fancy new engines, all this stuff, and then hopefully get into production. Where I see an opportunity, although it's tricky, but is to going into this operations and maintenance bucket where there's a lot of dollars, but this sustainment is critically important for warfighting readiness and effectiveness. And this could be anything from robots that are helping to depanel airplanes because it's a very labor-intensive task, robots that are painting airplanes, that are cleaning airplanes. It could be training platforms or systems that are upskilling our workforce in the military or our contractor workforce that keeps them abreast of the latest technologies. It could be things like supply chain or maintenance AI, that instead of having a written document, hey, my right engine had a engine hot light or whatever, then now I have to send a human in to figure it out. I have a database of all these maintenance actions that as soon as I push this button, it says, okay, that there's an 80% probability it's this, 20% this. Look at this first to save time. So these things are coming to the fore, and I think that's a really important and untapped opportunity in the defense market right now.
Right, totally. And we know that startups are difficult in general, right? But do you think that defense tech startups are more difficult to succeed than general startups? Would you put it that way?
I mean, I'd be talking my own book if I said yes, because I want to bump up my founders. I think any startup is incredibly hard. There are unique
Totally.
challenges
Yeah.
in defense tech. I think you do need a distinctive technical solution. You certainly have to have a distinctive go-to-market function in business to business. Um, but they're experts, and just like winning, Amazon was an impossibly hard startup when Jeff Bezos started, but he had a unique insight in the market and was laser focused on winning it. Anduril had that same approach. Some of the startups we're supporting have that similar approach and knowledge. It's hard in a different way. I don't want to say it's harder, but it's certainly hard in a different way. And you need people who acknowledge where the challenges are going to come into play compared to commercial markets.
Right, I totally agree with that. And who are the typical founders of defense tech startups? Are these like engineers, or are these more from defense background?
I think you see a little bit of both. Um, you have some engineers, especially the younger ones, who there's this resurgence of patriotism amongst Gen Z in America, which is I find very encouraging. And they want to do something for the country. And they said, okay, I studied this thing, or my grandfather served, or I see this gap in the battlefield. I'm going to go and build, and I'll build something and then show it to the government and do all the hard work to get it sold. But I'm going to build something. And then you have the folks who are coming out of the military saying, there's one called Vannevar Labs, which it was a couple of Intel officers who, or at least had insight into the intelligence community, and said, hey, there was this really deep need I felt when I was there. I'm going to build a solution to solve that and go kind of from the bottoms up. And they've found a lot of really good traction because they're building something the user needs. At the end of the day, I think you have to understand the user needs. Again, going back to the earlier conversation. But two, you really have to validate through the lobbying and time on the Hill, time in the Pentagon, what is going to resonate with the warfighter. And so you need the best of both worlds. Also seeing a number of second-time founders who have done the hard work in the commercial sector, sometimes defense, coming into defense because they know they have the capability to build a company and they want to serve the national interest, who are more savvy on the hiring and all this stuff that could be a little bit of creative. But I don't think there's one specific archetype. I think that the differentiating factor is patriotism, and the ones that are successful acknowledging it's a different go-to-market function than what they experience in the commercial world.
Right, totally. And what are the typical exit pathways for defense tech startups?
Well, we're very early. Typical is not yet typical. This is one of the challenges of the space. There are some unicorn defense startups. You look at, mentioned Anduril a couple times, but Shield AI is one of them. You have Epirus. You could even consider Palantir as a defense tech startup. Obviously, had a lot of early customers in the IC and DoD. IPO is what a lot of folks kind of look for. I think the IPO markets are very difficult right now. In general, there's a high expectation for revenue. You also have to be profitable. The other challenge there is the public markets tend to price things a lot more conservatively than the private markets. And so you look at what the defense primes are trading at the public market, 2.5x maybe as they go forward. Now you'd expect startups to do differently because they're going to have a different cost structure and they're potentially going to have higher upside with growth. But even then, it's relatively tepid. It's not the 5 to 10x multiples you're seeing for SaaS. And to that point, if you look at other alternative exit pathways, you look at the big private equity firms who previously have swept up some of these billion-dollar-plus organizations. Well, they also have a mismatch because a lot of them that play in aerospace and defense are typically investing in more private equity style companies that are cash flowing, that have grown slower but still serve an important market niche. And you look for that handoff, again, they're looking for the 1, 2, 3x multiples on revenue that are more traditional industry, whereas the high-flying defense startups, they've been priced at 10, 20, 30, sometimes more x of revenue based on potential future potential. at some point, those things have to converge. And I don't know which direction, but I'd probably say like the buyer is probably going to have a little more weight there. And so, what does that mean for defense return profiles? That's challenging. Where I think things may be headed is you're going to have some clear winners. You're going to have the ones that have the 10, 20, maybe even $30 billion IPOs. They're going to be very, very, very few and far between. What you could have are more middle of the road outcomes where you get a company that's sold for 500, 750, $1 billion, maybe in a great case, potentially more, but swept up by either an existing prime or one of these emerging new primes. Like what you see Anvil doing is they are kind of quietly but slowly, and they're doing some of this publicly, kind of buying up defense tech startups that are accretive to their hypothesis where the world is going for relatively reasonable rates, as that startup can't necessarily find the deep market traction needed to survive. Like that is a very unique strategy, and I think a good one. But you could see some of these primes come in and sweep up, the new rocket motor companies or the new engine companies or the new component companies, because they can't do the innovation at pace that these startups can, but they also have already broken through the Defense Department to understand the contracting needs. And so there may be a compromise between the old guard and new to keep these technologies alive. And what does that mean for venture returns then? Well, there's an implication because most venture outcomes have in the past been based on this very biased, not bias is the wrong term, but like very weighted power law return where you have one or two companies that get the 100, 200x, maybe 20 to 50 in some instances with a lot of failures. The question for me as an investor is, can I construct a portfolio in defense tech that maybe has one or two 10 to 20x's, but then put a number of 2 to 5x's in place, enough to mitigate the balance of the failures, but still get that net 3 to 5x return to capital to LPs, or in our case, our single LP. I don't know if that's the case, but I can see a world in which that plays out, which requires a different mindset for building and investing.
Yes, totally. Thanks for sharing that. Now, coming to my last main question before we do the rapid fire round. And this one is, what is the typical life cycle of a defense tech startup, and how is it different from a maybe tech startup, a software startup, right? So at what stage do you think they achieve the first product? And then at what stage are they expected to achieve maybe the first few customers and then going to scale? So tell us with what stage, what should be expected of a defense tech startup?
I think it's because things are so new, it's hard to like define a typical stage. Um, I think you have to have a first product that really excites the customers and excites the buyers, that's solving a real need. Then you have to show that you can scale that. And then you kind of bolt on ancillary opportunities either through internal R&D or external acquisitions, seeing where the puck is going in that particular vertical. I will say from a revenue standpoint, it's going to look very different. Uh, SaaS and even, I guess hard tech is more, hard tech in general probably more aligned with where we're going to go with defense tech, but the revenue is going to be more lumpy. In the sense that one year you might have 5 to 10 in revenue from government R&D contracts or early LRIP, low rate initial production contracts, and then maybe a dip while you're kind of getting the validation there and the government kind of gets its act together with some sort of funding mechanism or acquisition changes before you see the consistent revenue. And so I think it's not going to be an up and to the right smooth curve that you see with the really exceptional software companies. Or even, to be honest, some of the hardware companies that we've seen work in the commercial world. It's going to be up and down, and it's not going to be recurring revenue in the early stage. It's going to be a lot of R&D dollars. It's going to be non-dilutive capital. It's going to be high asset intensity investor from either the commercial or the public sector coming in to sustain these things while they validate their tech. And I think defense tech in particular is one of those where like it's not quite if you build it they will come, but that when you build it, there's already a ready-made market for it. It's just that for whatever reason, the tech hasn't been unlocked. Like hypersonic engines, for instance. Like we know that the right type of hypersonic engine, when built, will have a market for it. So people are trying to achieve that first hypersonic like minimum standard to then sell to that market. But there's a lot of technical challenges there. That's where the R&D funding comes into it. So a lot of R&D funding up front, and then hopefully you break through and win that, and then you have this market ready and waiting for you. That's a different type of revenue model that you see in the commercial world.
Yes, totally. So a different lens that's required for looking at defense tech startups, right? I think it's more related to deep tech than software startups. Is that
Yeah,
correct?
yeah,
Right.
100%.
Yeah.
Now, there are software startups in government, and those are really important too. But I think you look at the Palantir model, the early days were a little bit lumpier because it's big chunks of contracts. Like maybe you win a $10 million contract this year, and you maybe win like a $5 million next year, and then a $20 million, and like a 15, because they're going to give you all of it at once, as opposed to, okay, we got 10 seats in this company, and then the next they loved it so much they went to 100 seats. Now we had a new customer, and like there's so much steady growth. Like, this is like big blocks of dollars to some extent.
Yeah, got it. It's not very, it's not recurring like in software, right? It's more spontaneous and random, right?
Sure.
Okay. Now let's do the rapid fire round, wherein I'll ask you 5 quick questions about the investing you're doing at Cubit Capital, and you have to give 5 quick answers. Sounds good.
Go for it.
All right. So the first one is, what are the sectors and regions you invest in?
We have two broad categories. We call it frontier tech, and then we call it human flourishing. Within frontier tech, we do national security, we do industrial resilience, and then energy security. And human flourishing is a broader bucket, but we do education investments, we do some things like mental health, and we do some more kind of commercial focused things.
Got it. What's the typical stage of investment?
We like seed and Series A.
Got it. And what's the typical check size you put in?
We'll do anywhere from 500K to 2 million, depending on stage and traction.
Where can founders apply for funding in case there's a direct way?
Well, you can certainly email me, ben@cubit.capital. Always willing to talk to inspiring founders. Honestly, that's probably the best way. So
Totally. Last one, where can our listeners follow you?
I'm on Twitter, at Ben Kohlmann, Kohlmann, also on LinkedIn. And those are where I spend a lot of my writing time.
Awesome. I'll make sure to put all those links in the show notes below. Thanks so much for making time for this, Ben. It's been incredible talking to you, and I learned a ton personally, and I'm sure so did our listeners. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Prashant. I appreciate it.